Good morning. Hope you're all doing well. You're out of context. All right. Are you visiting? Don't mind us while we have a conversation. This is a friend from Chicago. All right. It's really awesome to be here with you in Miami this weekend. Amen. Thank you. To give you an idea of where I come from in Minneapolis, we were looking at some pictures this morning, and Kim was looking at a wedding back home that happened yesterday in the church, and she looked out the window and she said, "Is that water back there?" And I said, "No, those would be snowbanks out the window." So it's melting, but they're still there. This is a picture of my family. On the left side is my wife, Micretia. As James mentioned, we have 3 boys, one abnormally born. The one closest to my wife is by birth a nephew, but he's become ours. He's the reason I have no hair. And then my middle son, our oldest son is in the middle, Paviel, and on the end is the youngest, that is Elijah. And if you've ever seen the show Blackish and the character Junior, you now know my son Elijah. We've actually taken to calling him Junior because he's just like that kid on the show. So there you go. Amen. So we're going to talk this morning. The title of my message is Storming the Gates. And I want to start out, there's a scene in Matthew 22 where Jesus comes to the temple and he's there for the great festival of Passover and all the stuff going on that week. And the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders come to him and they try to trap Jesus, it says. And they ask him this question, "Tell us your opinion here. Should we pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" And it's easy for us to read a passage like this and go, well, you know, we should read it because it's in the Bible. But maybe in the back of your mind you go, there's not a lot there that connects for me with everyday life. Like we don't have to worry about Caesar. I don't know about temples and festivals. And I mean, we got to pay taxes. So maybe that's what it's about, paying taxes. But then you start to look below the surface and you see what's really going on here. And Jesus lives in an incredibly politically active environment. There's a lot of political controversy going on in Jesus' day. There's all kinds of movements of people and imperialism and people, you know, being subjugated by different people and then having to go and live in a different land in a different place. And so there's all that confusion of our identity is one thing, but we live over here. And now Rome is in charge. So our country is Rome, but that's not my people. And it's a different people. And there's all of this sort of thing swirling around. And who should we be loyal to? And even right there, I think you start to go, okay, that's a little more identifiable with today. That there's some parallels there. But they asked Jesus this question, and it's a lose-lose answer. You cannot answer this question well, especially when you're trying to influence this group of people and call them to something, and now they're throwing out political bombs at you. Because how do you answer it? I mean, it would be like going into a diverse crowd of people and then someone sticking a microphone in front of your face and going, "So, who'd you vote for in the last election?" No matter how I answer that, I feel like it's going to be wrong. Right? And this is the question before Jesus. It's not just should we pay taxes or not. It's much deeper than that. It's about pick a side. Choose. Vote. Lay down your loyalties. Are you going to stand with patriotism and country, the country that has soldiers around the world dying for your peace and your prosperity? Are you going to stand with country, or are you going to be over here with your people and your identity and the oppressed? And it's literally as though they're asking him, will you stand with country or kneel with your people? Which are you going to choose? And I think we face questions like that in the world today too. I don't know how to answer that. Whichever one I say, it's going to be wrong, right? And so Jesus' answer here is incredibly instructive for us. And we'll get to it in a little bit, but I'm going to guarantee, I have a suspicion that his answer is far more subversive and world-changing than you ever realized. And it's actually a pretty incredible answer. But before we get to that, I want to ask this question. How can we make a difference in the world today? In a world that's deeply divided by politics and identity and loyalty, how can we as followers of Jesus be faithful to Jesus and still make a difference in the world today? These are difficult questions, are they not? The first thing, and we're going to look at just a couple of aspects of how we can make a difference. The first thing is to realize that we have a dangerous calling. In Matthew 16, we find this scene in Jesus' life, and it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They're a little confused by that question, and they reply, well, nobody knows. Maybe John the Baptist, maybe Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. And then Jesus gets to his real point, what about you? Who do you say I am? And Peter answered, well, you're the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus, of course, says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, there's an interesting detail in here that kind of brings a whole new level to this passage that's very easy to miss. And the detail is simply this. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Now, if you've ever been to the area of Galilee, that's where Jesus grew up and ministered, as Galilee, right? And if you've ever been there, it's a very small area. You can be on a boat on the Sea of Galilee, and you can see all the shores of Galilee from that boat. It's not that difficult. And you can look and you can say, Jesus spent most of his life in ministry from there to there. And that's where he was. He walked back and forth in this just a few miles long area. And that's where it was. But every now and then, and this is one of those cases, it's as though what Matthew is indicating is he came to his disciples and he says, guys, we're going on a little field trip. Follow me. Because Caesarea Philippi is a 3-day walk from Galilee. So imagine you're one of Jesus' disciples. He says, hey, we're going to Galilee. Or we're going from Galilee, to Caesarea Philippi. So he walks with them for 3 days. He gets there, and he says, who do people say I am? Well, you're one of the prophets. Who do you say I am? Who are you going to proclaim me to be? You're the Messiah. He says, that's right. And the gates of Hades will not overcome that if you go proclaim that. Good talk. Let's go back to Galilee. And if you're like, I move too much for these things. Give me 1 second, sorry. If you're like the disciples, the disciples were prone to grumbling from time to time. I imagine if I'm there, I'm like, why did we just walk 3 days for him to ask this question and now we got to walk back 3 days? We could have done that in Galilee. But Jesus is a master teacher, and there's a reason, I believe, that he went to Caesarea Philippi. This is a picture. I don't know how well you can see that. This is a picture of Caesarea Philippi, and you see that dark area on the left. That is a cave, and then over on the right is a cutout in the rock. It's a huge rocky area. And this is just outside of ancient Caesarea Philippi. I believe, I don't know for certain, but I believe there's pretty good evidence in the text that this is the very spot where Jesus took his disciples. Now, here's what you need to know about this spot. In the first century, Jewish rabbis forbid any good Jew to go to this spot. Don't go to Caesarea Philippi, especially don't go there. Because it was a place of pagan worship. It was a place where they sacrificed to the goat god Pan. That's what that little cutout in the rock is they would put statues of the gods there. And they believed that literally in that cave, it was the gateway for the demonic and for the gods to come back and forth from the underworld into the present age. And so it was an evil pagan place where anything you can name was sacrificed. The gods were worshipped. It was not a place where good, God-fearing Jews should go. So imagine you're the disciples. Not only are you on a 3-day walk, when you get there, you're like, we shouldn't be here at all. Why? I mean, I know you're always pushing the envelope, Jesus, but come on. Here? You want to have the conversation here? In the shadows of this evil pagan place? Why go here to talk about who you are? There's one other little detail. Does anybody want to guess what the name of that cave was in the first century? It was called the Gates of Hades. Because it was literally the gateway to the underworld, to Hades. It's a rocky mountain. And I tell you, on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, here's what I think Jesus was telling them. When you go proclaim me to be the king, because that's what Messiah meant. When you go proclaim me to be king, don't just go to the comfortable places. Don't just go to the safe places and have the safe conversations. You go to the gates of hell. You go to the places where nobody would, in their right mind, would go. You go to the places that good religious folks say, maybe you should stay away from there. Maybe it's not safe. Maybe that's not a wise idea. They don't love God there. They don't respect God there. It's not a safe place for you to go. It's certainly not comfortable. You go to those places. You storm those gates of hell. You go into the gates of Hades and you proclaim me to be king and see what happens. And that's how I'm going to build my church. Not in the comfortable places, not in the country clubs and the palaces. I'm going to build it by you going to the very gates of Hades. To go to the countries where no one will go. To go to the neighborhoods that people are afraid to go. To have the conversations that you shouldn't have and aren't polite to have. Go those places and tell them I'm king. And that's how I'm going to build my church. That's a different and dangerous calling. The second thing is, to fulfill a dangerous calling, I believe we have to be led beyond. In Mark chapter 1, as Jesus is going out into the wilderness to be tempted, it has this little note, and it says, the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness. Now, I wonder if any of you are like me, where sometimes you sit there in those quiet moments and you start to go, I haven't seen the Spirit work in power in my life in a long time. Where's the Spirit? Where's the power of the Spirit? We hear the stories of, from the old folks. I'm going to identify with the young folks right now. We hear the stories from the old folks. I'm a millennial, Wow. Really? Was it that funny? Slightly older than a millennial. But we hear the stories of how the Spirit used to do amazing things. How, all these incredible stories and power and growth and everything. And we start to go, where is the Spirit? And people start to want to grab a hold of the Spirit, and they manufacture it as though the Spirit moving is me doing things like this, and as though the Spirit cares about, how I am, and how, all these fantastic sort of displays. That's not the power of the Spirit. But where is He? And I started to reflect and pray on that for a while. And as I started to look at my life, I realized, I've seen the Spirit work in power. But it's almost always when I'm in Africa. Has the Spirit left the United States? Is He on vacation in Africa? Because I could tell you amazing stories of things we've seen and experienced, just unbelievable. And then I realized, no, that's not it. Here's what it is. If you know me a little bit, it won't take you long to figure out that by nature, I'm actually an incredibly shy person. I'm very introverted. And if given the choice, I would stay in my house for the rest of my life reading books. It's what I would do. In fact, as a kid, I looked up to this guy. His name was actually Monty Montgomery, and he was a curator of the Historical Society, and he lived in a room above the Historical Society full of books, and he almost never left, and that's all he did was read and write. And I was like, now that's a gig right there. That's a life. So here's this shy introvert who can't stand to talk to people I don't know. I don't like to travel. And God puts me in this position and calls me to go around the world and speak in front of groups and teach. And part of me loves it and part of me hates it every time. And I realize that's the key. You see, when I go to Africa and I speak, or I go to, places, I'm going way beyond my own abilities. I'm pushing out into a place that I'm not comfortable, that I know I can't do on my own. And I think that's the key. If you look and you say, I haven't seen the Spirit work in power in my life in a long time, maybe it's because you've grown too comfortable. Maybe it's because you just have the conversations that feel safe. You reach out when, no one's around and it's a comfortable conversation. You go and you serve God or you do these things and it's just kind of routine, but you've stopped stepping out to the dangerous places in your life or in your character. You've stopped going, I'm going to be led by the Spirit so far beyond what I'm capable of doing that if He doesn't show up, I'm in trouble. You see that in the story of the Red Sea. When's the most dangerous moment as the children are crossing the Red Sea? It's not when they first step out and the water's parted. You can still get back to shore. You go a little farther, you can still get back to shore. But there's a point where you go out so far, it's like if God doesn't keep this water up, boy, we are in trouble. It's when you continue the journey and continue to go be led by the Spirit and be dangerous, that's when He has to show up. But too many of us are just milling around the shore with our hand there so we can jump back in case it gets too difficult. To make a difference, we have to be willing to go to the gates of Hades and be led way outside of our comfort zone by the Holy Spirit. I don't know what that looks like for you. I can't be specific, but I'll bet there's quite a number of you sitting here today as I'm saying this, and the Spirit's starting to knock on you. Remember that thing I keep putting in the back of your mind and you keep putting off and saying, maybe one day, maybe I should start this program, or maybe I should go here, or maybe I should. Just listen. Just listen to the Spirit. That's what discipleship looks like. I'm convinced in John 21, when the disciples are on the boat and they've been fishing and they can't catch anything, and Jesus appears on the shore and He's like, throw your nets over there. And that seems like a stupid idea. Yeah, we've already done that. Okay, we'll throw them over. They throw it over there and there's a huge catch of fish. Because discipleship is not about doing things that make sense or that are safe or that are comfortable. Discipleship is about shutting up and listening to Jesus guide you where to go. So just listen. I mean, do it with wisdom. Get the input of other people. Make sure it's something biblical. But listen to the Spirit. I'm not advancing here. Thank you. Now I went too far. Okay. The next area is when we go to the gates of Hades and when we're led beyond, we've got to willing to be salt and light. This is uncomfortable. Because most of us don't want to draw attention to ourselves, but that's the whole point of salt and light. You know when it's there. They're attention grabbers. Be salt and light. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Have you embraced that? I know far too often by my nature, I'm comfortable just let me take a step back. Way back here. In fact, I'll just kind of get as far back as I can. And it's not about drawing attention to me, it's about being who God made me to be, which is salt and light. He wants to use us, but we got to get out there. One of the ways I think we can do this is simply being proud of who we are as a movement, who God has made us to be. It was mentioned this morning, the communion, which was a great communion message, by the way. The minute, right after Genesis chapter 11, where there's the division of mankind, the very next thing, God comes to Abraham and He says, through you, I'm going to bless and gather the nations one day. And that promise continues throughout the Old Testament. Isaiah says, when the mountain of the Lord appears, the nations will stream to it. Isaiah sees the gathering of the nations. Daniel talks about the gathering of the nations. Habakkuk and Malachi and all of the prophets point to it. And when Jesus comes and he stands with his disciples at the Great Commission, he does not say, go make disciples. He says, go make disciples of all the nations. You see, it's part of the gospel. And Paul understood that. The book of Ephesians, in large part, is to help them understand that they must be multiracial to be the reflection of who God called them to be. It's easier to separate. It's easier to let the politics and identity divisions of the world come in and separate us. And Paul says, you cannot do that because you stop being salt and light the minute you allow that to happen. To the Ephesians, he says, I am so excited because I've heard about your love for all God's people. That's not just a generic term there. That's a elbow, wink, wink. We're bringing all the nations together in one group, and I know it's hard. But it's what the gospel is about. In Ephesians 2, he says he's made the two groups one. He's torn down the walls, the barriers. He's made one new humanity. This is what God is doing. You are no longer foreigners and strangers to God's family. You are part of his nation. In chapter 3, he calls it the mystery of Christ. As the different nations come together as one and see ourselves as one new humanity. He says that's the mystery of Christ. And if it was the mystery of Christ in the first century, it's still the mystery of Christ in the 21st century. Because 2,000 years later, the world still can't figure this out. I remember when I was younger, I was starting high school teaching in the 90s and late 90s, and all the buzz was, we're now a post-racial society. We've figured out this whole race thing. Oops. Perhaps not. And Ephesians 3 goes on and says this is how the wisdom of God is being shown. In this, that word manifold literally means many-colored. And he says, I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people. This is a huge way of how we're salt and light in the world. This is how we go show the world, look at what God has done. And you know what I see? If I can just say this on a practical level, you know that term, first world problems? You ever heard that term? Right? And people will be like, oh, my charging cord is too short and it doesn't reach my bed. Oh, I have it so rough. And then I'll go somewhere like, and I can think those things too. And then I'll go somewhere like Malawi where somebody, and I've literally seen somebody walk barefoot 12 miles to come to church and then 12 miles home. And you start to go, oh, yeah. I mean, it's not that far to walk to the cord. I can probably bring some water and make that journey. But here's what I think we do. I think we do the same thing with God's illustrious kingdom and the mystery of Christ. Because I go on social media and things like that. You know what I see? I see disciples complaining about issues of race more than they trumpet what God has done in our fellowship. They talk about issues out in the world instead of being salt and light to the world and saying, hey, come over here and look and see what God is doing in the One Miami church. This is why in Ephesians 4, Paul gets into so much talk about unity. He says God is all about unity. There's one this, there's one that, and his point is there's only one body. You can't have a Jewish church and a Gentile church. That's not salt and light. That's doing religion in the way of the world. If you have black church, Latino church, Asian church, white church, that's doing religion in the way of the world. It's not the mystery of Christ. And he says in chapter 6, keep on praying for all of God's people. But I think a generation later, at least part of the warning to this same church in Ephesus, we find in the book of Revelation, and he says, I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Now, he's definitely, I think, talking about love for God, but part of that love for God is the love for all God's people. That is repeated over and over again in the book of Ephesus. And he said, you drifted from that. You started to take it for granted. And I think we've done that sometimes too. Be salt and light. Be proud of what God has done. You all know this. This comes on your disciple test. The disciples were called Christians first where? In Antioch. I don't think you're allowed into heaven if you don't know the answer to that. Here's what I love about this. I realized this recently. And I love the word disciple. I love being a disciple, and that's still our identity. But as I started to understand this, it kind of made me fall in love with the word Christian again. Because for a long time I was like, oh, Christian, it's only 3 times in the whole, 270. Antioch was a very diverse city. Had all kind of ethnic groups, but it also was marked by ethnic violence. There was a great deal of sectarianism, division, separation. Everybody knew this is my group, that's your group, let's stay apart. There were riots, there was violence. That was Antioch in the first century. And here comes this group of Jesus disciples. And you can tell by the names of the leaders in the church in Antioch that are given to us in Acts that it was a very diverse group. And the church was equally diverse. And it appears what Luke is trying to highlight for us is that the folks in Antioch didn't know what to do with that. They would look at them and go, well, what kind of group are they? What ethnic group are they? They're not Jews. They're not Greeks. They're not Romans. They're not Scythians. They didn't know what to call them because they were so unique that they had to, they follow that Christos. We'll call them Christians. That's how different they were. I think we can stand out just the same in our world today, if we're willing to do it. Now let's go back to Jesus in the temple. Whose image is this? And whose inscription? This is what Jesus says. Here's his response. He asked for a coin. Give me a coin. They give it to him. Now this is already a little embarrassing because these coins, if you notice, whose image is on that? It's Caesar. You're not supposed to have images of human beings in the temple. That was idolatry. So these Pharisees are trying to trap him, and Jesus starts out by showing them their own hypocrisy. Hey, you got a coin on you? Yeah, sure. I found that on the ground over there. Not mine. Whose image is on this? And whose inscription? And of course they say Caesar. And he says, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Here's what he's not saying. Pay your taxes and your tithes. That wouldn't have shocked anybody. It wouldn't have been particularly revolutionary. It wouldn't have been particularly unique. What Jesus does here is appeal to a long-standing Jewish tradition that goes all the way back, to Genesis chapter 1. And it's connected to a Hebrew word, selem. The Hebrew word selem can be translated as idol, as in a statue like an idol, or image. And in the ancient world, when a temple was built for a god, and they were going to put the selem of the god, they would place it in the temple, and it would be the representation of that god in the creation temple. And Genesis 1 says that when God made the earth, the whole earth was his temple. And he took human beings, not statues, but live human beings, and made them in his selem, in his image, and placed them in this creation in his image to reflect his rule and his reign and his love into the world. We were made to do God's will. When we do our own will, we cease to be what God made us to be. It's actually animals that God made to look after their own interests. That's the height of animal existence. We were made to reflect God's will, not our own. In fact, that's what sin is when we do our will instead of God's. And if you think about it, the biblical theme is always when we do our own will and look after our own interest, what's the image given? We become like the beast. Nebuchadnezzar, when he decided to look after his own interests instead of God's, God says, you want to act like a beast? We'll go ahead and let you be one for a while. And of course, in Revelation, what's the ultimate image of evil and rebellion against God? The beast. We were made in God's image. But we started to do our own will and we lost that image. But the Bible tells us that Jesus came and was the image of God. He said, I came to do God's will. And he did it perfectly. And so he was the image of God. And the New Testament tells us that in Christ, we can be renewed in the image of God. So what is Jesus saying here? Picture this. He's holding a coin up in front of this hotbed of political strife. And he says, whose image is on this? Caesar's. Yeah, this is what matters to Caesar. Money, power, politics. If he wants that, give it to him. But whose image is imprinted on you? Who do you belong to? Give to God what is God's. If Caesar wants what he thinks is his, give it to him. But you belong to God. And do you see what he's done here? He's blown up the argument. Do I stand with country or do I stand with people? The powerful or the oppressed? He says, yes, I will stand up to the powerful. I will stand up to the dragon. I will stand up to imperialism. And I will say what you need is to be restored in the image of God. You are following the way of the dragon, the way of the beast, and not the way of your maker. But I will also challenge my people. I won't just say, oh, you're oppressed. Poor you. Yes, I will stand up for you, but I will also challenge you to say you can also be following the way of the dragon if you're obsessed with the power of the dragon. You need to be restored to the image of God as well. Both sides need to be challenged. I'm not saying spiritualize everything and don't make a change in the world, but Jesus said it doesn't matter what side you're on, the dragon is there. We need to be restored to God's image as the people of God and deal with injustice and hatred and evil within God's kingdom and spread God's kingdom, not go out and try to fix the world. Jesus said, you'll always have the poor with you. You can't change that. You've got to focus on God's kingdom, not just the spiritual version of it, but the real full deal, the power of God's kingdom that tears down the imperial powers, that tears down the dragons, that makes sure there's no surplus or lack, that brings people in and says, this is a different way to live. But we've been too comfortable spiritualizing the kingdom and not letting the full power of it loose. The last point is really simple. Be perfect. That's easy, right? Last, I believe it was August, my wife and I had some airline vouchers from flights that were delayed or canceled or whatever, and I realized a few months beforehand that our anniversary was coming up, and this thought popped into my head, and I was like, I've always wanted to take my wife to Paris, but I could never afford it. And so I looked and I was like, we have just enough vouchers. So I looked online, I was like, ooh, and tickets are kind of cheap. So we got 2 tickets to Paris for our anniversary for $25. Plus the vouchers, but $25 out of my pocket, right? So I'm like, hon, I'm taking you to Paris. And I'd like proper credit for this. So we're in Paris for our anniversary, which was awesome. And one evening we were out and we came back to this little hotel we were in. It was a small little room. And we sat down and my wife went to sleep. And I was like, well, I'm not tired, so I'm going to turn on the TV and watch a little TV. So I turned on and started flipping around, and it was really frustrating, but all the channels were in French. Do they not know that Americans, we don't speak French? In fact, I felt bad when the brother came up and he was saying hi in all those languages this morning. I thought, okay, I can say like hola and hello, and the rest of them are like Jambo and Sabona. It's not going to do any good here. Unless anybody speaks Swahili. Anyone? I didn't think so. I don't do French. I spent a year trying to learn French, and I came up with, after a year, I can say 1 sentence in French. And it's not really, it's the monkey eats an orange. That's all I can say. So I find one channel in English, and it's CNN. I was hoping for ESPN, but I got CNN. So here we are, and guess what weekend it was? I'll say one word: Charlottesville. And so I'm watching the coverage of Charlottesville. Now, I showed you a picture of my family, and so I can tell you that the events there kind of caught my eye. We've been traveling the world speaking on race and culture. I'm like, well, if nothing else, this administration is good for business. It seems to bring up passions in people. And just the way the world is, and that's not a shot at anybody, that's just reality. And so I watched the coverage. And I started to, now here's the thing. I've written a book at this point on the Sermon on the Mount about loving enemies. And thinking, I got that down pretty good. And then I'm watching this coverage without even realizing and going, oh yeah. Bring those white supremacists down. They should be shamed. They should be called out. They should be, And I started to realize in my heart, I hate white supremacists. You see, when we're called to go to gates of Hades and we're called to be active and be salt and light and go out in the world, it will expose quickly that we're human beings and there are groups we don't like. And so after a couple days of that, I went out running one morning, and I felt like I like to pray when I run, and God just started to sit on me and say this question: who's going to love the white supremacists? And I was like, even those tiki torch carrying people that would hate me, hate my family, hate everything I do? Nope. They deserve to be called out. They deserve to be hated. And I started to wrestle with it. And after praying about it, I came back to my wife in the hotel that morning, and I said, I feel like God's calling me to love white supremacists. And she said, wait, hold up, what? And I was like, not like, start going to Klan rallies or anything, but I said, I don't know. I think it's more a heart thing for me I got to wrestle with. And she was like, okay, all right. 2 days later, we get on the plane, and we're ready to fly home. And there was 3 seats in the middle aisle of a plane, and I was on one aisle, my wife was on the other aisle, and there was an empty seat in between us. And she likes to do that, hoping we get that, the empty seat. And right before they closed the door, this guy, and I'm reading a book, and this guy came up, he goes, excuse me, I'm sitting there. And I was like, oh, okay. So I got up, let him in, he sits down, I sit down, I'm in my book, and I glance over, and he's got short sleeves on, and from sleeve to hand are white supremacist tattoos. And I'm sitting there looking at my book like, you think you're funny, don't you, God? Nope. I'm like, nope. I'm going to go back to reading this book about loving all people. And in that moment, I realized I had to make a decision. Am I going to do my will or God's? And I turned around and I started to talk to him. And we had a good 20-minute conversation. And I'd like to tell you that when we got off the plane, he got baptized. But what actually happened is after about 20 minutes, my wife leaned forward and said something. And I said, hon, we can just do that when we get home. We can take care of it. And she goes, okay. And that guy went. And he never said another word to me again. And that's okay. Because, see, it wasn't about him. It was about my heart. Because Jesus says, this is in that passage where he says, love your enemies. Even the world can love people who agree with them. He said, love your enemies, because that's what God does. And he says in this passage, see, there's no one outside of God's love. There's no group outside of God's love. The word perfect there is, in the Greek, it's teleos. It means complete. And he says, God is complete. He is perfect in loving his enemies. In other words, there's no group that is outside of God's concern and love. No group who has done so much, or no individual that has done so much that God says, nope, too far. I'm not going to love them. I'm not going to offer them an opportunity. And Jesus said, that's how your Father is, so you be perfect in your love the way he is perfect in his love. There's no group outside of your love. That's what we're called to. Here's the end thought to think about. What is your gates of Hades? Where's the place where you feel like maybe I shouldn't go? But God wants you to go there and proclaim him as the king. When's the last time you experienced the power of the Spirit in your life? Is it because you're too safe? Is there something keeping you from going? What do you need to do to deal with that? Whom do you need to love? And maybe the final question that sums this all up, and I'm just going to end with this question, is how much like Jesus do you want to be? Thank you this morning.